Hey guys, this is Key Lee. I'm back with you this time for a 5-part series on preflop fundamentals. The goal is to establish a solid preflop foundation for our game so that we can build other layers on top of it. The course is designed as a step-by-step process where we can start from the beginning on our journey to becoming a solid winning poker player. It is absolutely critical for beginning players to build a strong preflop foundation, but I believe that this will be helpful for anybody looking to improve their game. We can identify and fix any leaks that we might not have been aware of, and just clean up our preflop play so that it is solid and fundamentally sound. If you're wondering why I have a golf picture for this video, it's because I like to compare preflop in poker to putting in golf. Putting is not exactly the most exciting part of the game, and it's a bit tedious and boring. Yet, working hard on putting improves one's score much more than working on any other part of the game. Yeah, it's pretty sexy to be able to drive 330 yards, but if it takes you 3 or 4 strokes on the green to sink the ball, your score will be terrible. A long drive or a short putt both count as one stroke, meaning that an accurate putt is much more effective in improving one's score. Yet, people would much rather spend hours at the driving range than honing their putting skills. In poker, pre-flop is somewhat similar. It's not exactly the most fun part of the game, and people would much rather watch some sick check raise bluff on YouTube than to master their pre-flop fundamentals. I believe that pre-flop is where some of the biggest mistakes are made in poker by losing players, and even small winning players often have pretty big leaks in their pre-flop game. Often these leaks go unnoticed because they seem pretty small in isolation, but over time they accumulate and add up to massive losses. Also, bad pre-flop decisions become magnified post-flop, and we find ourselves in many precarious spots post-flop if we are sloppy pre-flop. Any great poker strategy involves starting with solid pre-flop fundamentals. No Limit Hold'em is a game of initiative and position. By initiative, I mean being aggressive. Even the earliest books like Super System advocate being aggressive in No Limit. This is because being aggressive is pretty awesome. By betting, we give ourselves two different ways to win: when we show down the best hand or when the villain folds. In contrast, when we call, we only have one way to win: by showing down the best hand. Therefore, it's critical that we mostly enter the pot with a raise. When we have the initiative, it gives us the best chance to win the hand. As the pre-flop raiser, people will often check to us on the flop, and we have the first shot at making a continuation bet and winning the pot. If the caller and the pre-flop raiser both miss the flop, the pre-flop raiser has a much higher chance of taking down the pot. With any unpaired hand, there's about 70% chance of missing the flop. This means that as the pre-flop raiser in position, we should be able to bet after our opponent checks and take it down a high percentage of the time. Now, the concept of position is pretty simple and also very important. The first two positions are considered early position spots: under the gun and under the gun +1. Then we have middle position: MP1, MP2, and hijack. Then we have late position, which is cutoff and the button. We need to be tight from early positions, and we can be a little bit looser in the later positions. For example, if we're under the gun, there are 8 players to act behind us. If we limp or raise with a weak hand like Queen Jack offsuit, there's a good chance that somebody behind us has a better hand than us and will raise or re-raise us. Then we're faced with the decision of folding and wasting our money that we already put in, or calling a raise out of position versus a villain who likely has a better hand than us. This is why it's imperative that we play tight from up front. We're out of position and there are many players to act behind us who may raise. As we get closer to the button, our example hand of Queen Jack offsuit has a better chance of being the best hand. The risk of us getting raised becomes diminished as we get to later positions. On the button, we only have to get through the blinds to win the pot. So as we get closer to the button, we can come in for a raise with some of the weaker holdings. Hands that were once trash from up front, like King Jack off, Queen Jack off, and Ace 10 off, now become pretty good in hijack or later. We can now confidently raise these hands from later positions and expect to take down the blinds pretty often. Even if we get called, we have position post-flop, which gives us a pretty big edge. Having position post-flop is very advantageous because we act after our opponent, and this gives us a lot of information about our villain's hand. We can realize our equity better, dictate the size of the pot that we want to play, get to showdown cheaper, value bet more effectively, and bluff more easily. This is the power of position. Now, don't take this too far where you start raising with any two cards from late positions. People will catch on and start playing back at you. And raising with garbage hands like 5 deuce offsuit and 7-3 offsuit has very little value, if not negative expected value. Hopefully this video sold you on the importance of preflop fundamentals. Next, we will look at suggested opening ranges from different positions when we are the first to enter the pot. So now we're going to look at some suggested opening ranges from different positions. Keep in mind that these are just some rough guidelines to start with. These are my default ranges, but we can definitely make adjustments depending on a variety of factors, like game texture, game flow, stack sizes, who's to our left, and who's in the blinds. It's still nice to have some sort of a baseline, so I put these together. If you don't already have opening ranges mapped out for different positions, I would suggest memorizing these charts, and you can custom tailor your own range that caters best to your game. As discussed in part 1 of our preflop series, we generally want to come in for a raise. It gives us the best chance to win the pot preflop and postflop. It also helps us to keep our opening ranges balanced. If we limp some hands and raise some hands, both of these ranges will be unbalanced and we can be vulnerable to anyone who's paying attention. In live poker, we've all seen those guys who love limp re-raising aces and kings. When these guys actually raise under the gun instead of limping, they have a big problem. Their range is pretty face up and immediately capped. We don't want to be that guy. Also, there are some games, especially loose passive games at lower stakes, where we might be able to get away with some open limping, hands like small pocket pairs. But to start, let's keep everything simple and let's always come in for a raise when we enter pots. Just like the suggested opening ranges, let's start with a baseline and we can adjust and deviate from the strategy as necessary. So for now, we will always come in for a raise when we're the first to enter the pot. Let's talk really quick about sizing. What is the right amount? And there is no right answer. Typically, players raise 3 to 4 times the big blind. Generally, in live games, I usually open for about 3.5x the big blind or 4x. In some of the smaller games, it can be normal to even open for 5x. I usually tend to raise larger from up front and smaller from later positions. For example, in 5-10, I would open for 35 from every position and then open for 30 from cutoff and button. One thing we have to make sure is that we do not change our sizing according to the strength of our hand. This may sound very elementary, but it's very common in live poker. We've all seen this. Many players raise big with their big hands and small with small hands. Some also raise big with good but not nutted hands that they don't want to see a flop with. Say something like queens, jacks, tens, or ace king. So we definitely don't want to fall into this pattern. Having a uniform opening size helps us to be balanced in our preflop range where we can have jack 10 suited or aces with the same sizing. So let's always come in for a raise when we're the first to enter the pot, and let's always use one sizing for a given position. It's okay to change sizing for different positions, but not for different hands. So let's take a look at my default under the gun opening range. Here it is, top 9.35% of hands, sevens through aces, suited broadways, ace queen off, ace king off, ace 5 suited, 10-9 suited, and 9-8 suited. Pretty tight. Let's take a look at this matrix really quick. If you look at this diagonal line here in the middle, that's all the pocket pairs from deuces all the way up to aces. I'm going to click on pocket sevens. And down here you can see all the possible different suit distributions. And you can see that there are 6 different combinations to make a pocket pair. It says the number of combos below the hand. Off to the right is suited hands. So I'll click on ace king here, ace king suited, and obviously there's 4 possible combinations of ace king suited, the different suits: spades, hearts, clubs, and diamonds. Pretty simple. Off to the left, these are the unsuited hands or offsuit hands. I click on ace king offsuit here, and you can see there's a lot more possible combinations of ace king offsuit. These are the possible suit distributions, and there's 12 combinations of ace king offsuit. So as you can see, you can make an unpaired hand and have 16 different combinations of unpaired hand, 12 offsuit and 4 suited. So these are some of the numbers that will come handy if you have them memorized. 6 different ways to make pocket pairs, and 16 different ways to make an unpaired hand, 12 offsuit and 4 suited. So let's take a look at my range here. As discussed earlier, we're playing very tight from early position here and only opening the top 9.3% of our hands. Obviously, we're opening all the big pairs all the way down to sevens. And if you see, we're opening a lot more suited hands than unsuited hands. As a matter of fact, we only have ace king and ace queen for offsuit hands that we're opening from here. I like to open a lot of these suited hands because these hands play very well on a lot of the boards. They have very good playability in future streets. We can realize our equity well with these hands, which we will discuss in detail later. I also added 10-9 suited and 9-8 suited for board coverage. We want to be able to hit a variety of flops. By having hands like 9-8 suited, we can hit flops like 5-6-7 and 9-9-4 and so forth. Now, ace-5 suited, this seems just kind of out of place all by himself. And ace-5 suited is actually much better than hands like ace-9, ace-8, ace-7, or ace-6. It can make a straight. And it's also the strongest out of the wheel aces. So this also helps with some board coverage and deception to our range. If the board comes out something like 5-5 deuce, your villain will be in for a nice little surprise. So this is my under the gun range. Let's move on to under the gun 1. Still very tight. I just added a few more hands. Ace-4 suited, Jack-9 suited, and 8-7 suited. We're opening 10.3% of hands, still very, very tight. Let's take a look at the MP1 range. We added a few more hands. Ace-9 suited, Ace-3 suited, added Queen-9 suited, and a couple suited connectors down to 6-5 suited. Now we're opening 5s plus, and ace-jack offsuit and king-queen offsuit. We're opening 14.5% of our hands. Notice that I didn't include ace-deuce suited, even though you can also make a wheel. Just something really quick. Ace-deuce suited is actually the worst wheel ace. It's significantly weaker than the rest of the wheel aces because it's the only wheel ace that cannot flop a double gut shot. Let's move on to MP2. Now we're opening all the suited aces and pocket pairs. Added some suited connectors down to 5-4 suited. I added 10-8 suited plus, King-9 suited, and we also added ace-10 off and king-jack off. This position is also called the low jack, and it's the first opening position in a 6-handed game. Moving over to hijack. Now we're opening all the offsuit broadways. I added queen 8 suited, jack 8 suited, some of the suited gappers like 10 8 suited, 9 7 suited, 8 6 suited. Next is the cutoff, and we added ace 9 off, ace 5 off, and king 7 suited, jack 7 suited, and some suited 2 gappers like 10 7, 9 6, and 8 5 suited. We also added the suited gapper all the way down to 6 4 suited. And we're opening top 31.5% of our hands now. Finally, my favorite position, the button. As you can see, we're opening pretty wide from here. We're opening all the ace, any suited king, queen 5 suited plus, jack 6 suited plus, 10 6 suited plus, 9 5 suited plus, 8 4 suited plus, 7 4 suited, 6 3 suited. Opening top 44.5% of hands. We only have to get through the blinds, and our chances of getting 3-bet has decreased tremendously. So we can expect to win fairly often, and we're guaranteed position post flop, so we can get a little aggressive from this position. We even added some of the weaker offsuit hands like king 9 off, queen 9 off, jack 9 off, and a7 off plus. So again, I want to remind you that these ranges are just guidelines. They're simply a baseline from which to start, and we can make adjustments as necessary. For example, if we have a 3-bet monkey to our immediate left, we'll have to tighten up quite a bit. And also, if you have a huge VIP in the big blind, we would want to open wider than these charts. Having tight players behind you also allows you to open wider. Let's say we have 3 very tight players to our left. We're effectively playing 6 max ranges even if we're playing full ring. And it's very similar to having the button 3 times each orbit. This can be very advantageous for an aware and aggressive player. So if you don't have preflop charts all mapped out already, I would suggest starting with memorizing these and then adjust them as necessary to suit your particular game. I think this is the basic foundation for a solid post-flop game plan. Next, we're going to look at playing versus limpers and playing versus another player's opens. Now, let's talk about responding to opens. So this is when someone has already opened the pot with a raise and we're facing the decision to call, fold, or re-raise. In live poker, some of the biggest mistakes pre-flop is calling too much and not 3-betting enough. A really good basic preflop formula for calling with speculative hands is laid out by Bart Hansen in his 15-25-35 podcast. It's a guideline for players to use when calling with small pocket pairs, suited connectors, and suited aces. We need 15 times the raise size and effective stacks to set mine with small pairs, 25 times the raise size with suited connectors, and 35 times the raise size with suited aces. The theory behind this is that we need proper stack depth so that we win a big enough pot when we get lucky and make a strong hand. This is a great strategy, especially for beginning players who are trying to fix their massive preflop leaks. But the premise behind this is that we're only playing fit or fold post-flop where we never really try to win if we don't hit. So we're playing our hand like a lotto ticket to hit a big flop, and we just give up if we miss. It's kind of like the saying, no set, no bet. Again, nothing wrong with this approach, especially when starting out. But as we grow as poker players, we can do a little more than just trying to hit our hands. And some of the hands are not so clear-cut speculative. Hands like 8s, 9s, 10s, or even jacks can be kind of in between. They're not quite big pairs, and they're not just small pairs where we just fold if we don't hit, right? Also, some of the bigger suited Broadway cards like Jack 10 suited, Queen Jack suited, and King Queen suited are not quite like small suited connectors. We can definitely make some strong hands just by hitting a pair. Same with some of the bigger suited aces like Ace 10 suited and Ace Jack suited. So another way to look at the preflop situation is where we take the different hands that we might want to play and see how they stack up in equity and playability versus the opening range of our villains. One of the first things to note is that we need to play a tighter range than the villain's opening range. Some of the online training sites advocate only continuing with about 2/3 of the hands that the villain is opening. So if the villain is opening top 10% of his hands from under the gun, we're only supposed to continue with about top 6.7% of our range versus that open. In live poker, typical players are probably continuing with about 2 to 3 times as much as someone's opening range. So here they might be continuing with about 20 to 30% of their range. I think I like using a strategy where we're continuing with about 3/4 of the hands that the villain is opening. Again, this is not a rocket science, but just some rough approximate math and some sort of guideline to get us started with. Let's take a look at a couple examples. If a villain opens under the gun, we'll round up his opening range to about 10%. So we're supposed to continue with about 75% or 3/4 of that opening range. So 3/4 of 10% is 7.5. So this is the range that we're going to continue with, our top 7.5% of hands. Pretty simple. Now, if the villain opens MP1, he's opening about 15% of his hands. Again, we want to continue with about 3/4 of that, which is 11. So we want to continue with the top 11% of our range versus his MP1 open. Now, if you see, we have ace-jack off and king-queen off here in our continuing range. And I would much rather continue with some of these good suited connectors or pocket pairs, or maybe even the good suited small aces rather than these hands. So this is where raw equity versus realized equity comes in. And to demonstrate this, we'll look at an example of deuces versus ace-king of spades. And if they're all in preflop, it's pretty much 50-50. This is the raw equity that they have against each other. Pretty simple. If you were to assume a flop of 10-5-3 rainbow, and again, if they're all in on the flop, this is the raw equity that the hands have against one another. Deuces has 68%, and ace-king of spades has 32%. But if you were to assume that they're not all in on the flop, and they have to play the turn and the river, which hand would you rather have? And it's pretty easy to see that it's hard for deuces to continue beyond the flop and actually get to showdown. Oftentimes, it's going to be forced to fold and forfeit its equity in the pot. So deuces has low realized equity. On the other hand, if you look at ace-king of spades, there are a ton of good turn cards where it can continue. An ace or a king will give it top pair, a queen or jack will give it a Broadway gut shot, a deuce or 4 will give it a wheel draw, and any spades will give it backdoor flush draw. Ace-king of spades can comfortably continue versus a lot of bets on the flop and get to the river and get to realize its full equity by showdown. So ace-king of spades has much better playability than deuces. Another way of saying it is that ace-king of spades has higher realized equity than deuces here. Realized equity is an estimation of how much of the equity a hand can actually realize. In this example, even though deuces had 68% raw equity on the flop, if we were to assume that it only had 50% realized equity, that means that the actual expected value is about half of 68%, or 34. So deuces in reality has 34% equity here, if not all in on the flop. This chart comes from one of the poker softwares called Power Equilab, and we're looking at the playability or realized equity of different hands. When you look at these numbers here, I want to start by saying that these numbers are imperfect and somewhat inaccurate. They should not be taken literally. A lot of it is based on different assumptions like ranges and positions for the two players and how the computer expects them to play post-flop on different runouts and stuff. So the exact figure of realized equity for a particular hand is not very meaningful. It says aces has 170%, but what does that actually mean, right? What's important to recognize is seeing how certain types of hands have higher realized equity in comparison to others. So if you look at the chart here, they're color coded, and the hands with dark green colors have very high realized equity, and hands with dark red have very low realized equity. And as you can see, high pairs have very good realized equity. Same thing with high cards, suited cards, and connected cards. These hands flop very well, and they can continue beyond the flop to showdown and realize their full equity. You can see King Queen suited has 101%, King Jack suited has 98%. On the other end of the spectrum, these hands have very poor playability and very low realized equity. Hands like 10-5 offsuit has 47%. These cards are unpaired, low, unsuited, and disconnected. And oftentimes, it's not going to flop very well, and a lot of these hands are going to be forced to fold and forfeit its equity. So back to the continuing range versus an MP1 open. We wanted to select the top 11% of hands to continue versus his MP1 opening range, but instead of choosing the top 11% of hands with the highest raw equity, I would much rather choose some hands with higher realized equity, hands with better playability. So instead of calling with ace-jack offsuit or king-queen offsuit, I would much rather call with jack-10 suited, 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited, 7-8 suited, these small pocket pairs, and good suited aces like ace-3, ace-4, and ace-5. We take a look at if the villain opens from the hijack, he's opening about 25% of hands, and 3/4 of that is our continuing range, which is 18%. So this is the top 18% of hands with the highest raw equity. But instead of continuing with some of these weaker offsuit broadways, I'd much rather continue with some of these hands with better playability and realized equity. 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited, all these good suited connectors, pocket pairs, and suited aces. Now, you might think that this is too much work and not really feasible to do at the table. What we can do is a couple practical things. Instead of trying to calculate and map out what the 75% of villains' opening range is, what we can do is use the range for opening position that is one spot ahead of the PFR. For example, if the villain opens cutoff and we're on the button, we can use one position in front of the cutoff, which is hijack, and use that as our continuing range. As you can see, the hijack opening range is about 75% of the cutoff opening range, so it works out pretty nicely. If the villain opens the hijack, we can use MP2 opening range to see what hands we want to continue with. If he opens MP2, then we can use MP1 opening range, etc. Also, another simple trick we can use is when we're playing at the table, we can just estimate what the villain's opening range is and then simply continue with a slightly tighter range. These are very simple and rough estimation, and they will give you a much more solid range than most of the live villains. But if you can put some time away from the table to really study these charts, a lot of the situations will become more intuitive. We can adjust as necessary according to different villains, but there can be some exceptions in live poker where we have some epic recreational players. Let's say the villain is opening a ridiculous amount, like 100%. We don't want to just blindly follow the previous guideline and continue with 75% of that range. We don't want to be continuing with hands like Jack 5 offsuit here. I would definitely want to play a lot of pots with them, but we also have to consider that other players may also get involved and we will have to play these garbage hands in multi-way pots. So obviously some common sense here will go a long way. In this video, we talked about how to figure out optimal continuing range versus someone else's open. Next, we will discuss how to divide our continuing range into flatting range and 3-betting range. Okay, let's look at how to respond versus limpers. We can obviously overlimp or ISO raise versus limpers. These dynamics are somewhat unique to live poker as there are almost no limping on online games. Let's take a look at ISO raising first. I think that isolating limpers is not as systematic like opening ranges. Limping ranges vary greatly among players, so each situation is very villain dependent. It is also dependent on the skill level of the limper, the number of limpers, and stack sizes. ISO raising is more of an art than science. When you have a big recreational player in the big blind, you are incentivized to open wider than your normal opening range so that you can play more pots versus the VIP. But when a big VIP limps, it's even better than having him in the big blind. When he limps, often we can eliminate some of the strongest parts of the villain's range. So basically, we're getting a target villain to define his range and putting money in the pot. With a limper, we can make the raise size bigger than normal. I usually add one big blind for each limper. For example, my normal open at 510 is $35, but I'll add $10 for each limper. Because our raise size will be bigger with a limper, we get a better chance of folding out players behind us. We get a higher chance of getting heads up in position versus a weak player with a weak range. I can't think of too many situations in poker more profitable than this. When considering which hands to isolate, it depends on the limping range and the skill level of the villain. Most of the times, weak passive players limp with weak hands that they want to see a cheap flop with. We want to attack these limps very aggressively. But some players limp with strong range with the intention of limp re-raising. Versus these villains, the obvious counter is to overlimp a lot and not ISO raising very wide. Also, the worse the VIP is, the more we want to attack his limps. Stack sizes also matter. I tend to refrain from isolating villains too aggressively if their stack is short. We have less maneuverability and options post-flop with short effective stacks. Even though I don't like having a rigid system for isolating, if we were to construct a rough ISO raising range, I would start with using opening range from the position. So if I'm MP1 and we have an under the gun limper, this is the range that I'll look to isolate him with. And also it depends on the skill level and his limping range. I may ISO tighter or looser than my MP1 opening range. One detail is that I usually won't go too much wider than my MP2 opening range, even if you're in later positions like hijack, cutoff, or the button. Some of the hands in the late position opening range is just way too weak to ISO. So if you look, this is my MP2 opening range, and this is the widest baseline for isolating. Also, another thing to consider is the number of limpers. Versus one limper, we can be fairly aggressive, but versus two, we need to be a little tighter in ISOing. And versus 3 or 4 limpers, we need to be very tight, unless of course all of them are very weak recreational players. Usually versus 3 or 4 limpers, my ISO raising range might look like my under the gun opening range. As you can see, there are a ton of variables involved when it comes to isolating limpers. This is why I consider ISOing more of an art than science. Let's take a look at an example. If you're in MP1 and a fun player limps in front of us, we'll start by looking at what our MP1 opening range is, which is this. And this is also going to be our isolating range. Of course, we're going to make some adjustments as necessary. And one of the adjustments that I like to make is that I don't usually like isolating with small pocket pairs, 6s and below. I think that these have poor post-flop playability, and they play much better as an overlimp. So here from this position, I might ISO 7s plus and all these other hands in my range, and I might overlimp 6s and below, and maybe some of the smaller suited connectors like 7-6 suited, 6-5 suited, and maybe limp in with also some of the smaller suited aces here. On the subject of overlimping, this brings up some more unique live poker dynamics. In previous video, we talked about never being the first to enter the pot with a limp, but this is a little different. This is overlimping behind someone who already open limped. Often, one person limping creates a domino effect where many others are inclined to also limp along for the party. In most of the lower stakes games, this gives us a chance to over limp with some speculative hands behind the initial limper, even if we don't normally play these hands from that position. For example, if a big VIP limps under the gun and we're under the gun 1, this is the range that we're going to play from that position. You're going to see that we don't have small pocket pairs. But if I have a hand like 6s or like 4s or deuces, I'm definitely limping. We definitely want to see a lot of flops with the VIP. And the initial limp will often create 5 to 6 way limp pots. Often, players behind will over limp even some of their normal raising hands. So here I'm going to over limp with some of the small pairs and some of the smaller suited aces and maybe even some small suited connectors like 7-6 suited and 6-5 suited. Now sometimes there's going to be a party foul and somebody's going to make a big raising position. Then we're going to have to consider what kind of pot odds we're getting, the remaining stack sizes, and if anybody else came along for the ride. So when considering an overlimping range, I will choose all of my hands in my opening range from that position and then ISO raise the strongest part of that range. Another example, if early position limps and we're in MP1, let's look at that range. We're isolating all these hands, but I'm going to be over limping these small pairs, 6s through deuces, and some of the smaller suited connectors here and the smaller suited ace. Now, we have to be careful about over limping too much with weak hands, especially from earlier position, and especially if the table is aggressive and there's rampant pre-flop raising. We could be leaking money if there's a lot of aggressive pre-flop raising and we have to limp fold. So when considering limping in from earlier positions with speculative hands, make sure that you know the table dynamics and you're not limp folding too much. Obviously, as we get into later positions, we can over limp more and it'll be profitable. Next, we have one VIP who limps in from middle position and it folds to us on the button. So this is our opening range from the button, and obviously we're not going to isolate with all these hands. A lot of these hands are just way too weak to ISO. So we're still going to isolate our MP2 range even if you're on the button. Here we're going to ISO all these hands and then as we talked about, limp along with the smaller pocket pairs, maybe some of the smaller suited connectors and suited aces. And also, we can over limp any hands here in this range that we didn't isolate with. As you can see, we can over limp a lot wider than in the previous example. Last one. If we have 4 limpers and we're in the cutoff, now we have to be tight in our ISOing range. Our cutoff opening range is this, and we definitely can't ISO all these hands. Versus 4 limpers, I'm gonna use more like my under the gun range for isolating. I probably make it like $40 in 2.5 or $80 in 5.10. Then I will look at what my cutoff range is and still over limp all these hands that we didn't ISO with. Let's recap. Facing a limp, we can either ISO raise or over limp. Isolating a weak player can be very profitable, even more so than when he's in the big blind. With a limper, we can make bigger raises and get a good chance of getting heads up in position versus a weak player with a weak range. We can raise more aggressively versus weaker players. Versus multiple limpers, we need to be tighter in our ISOing range. Smaller pocket pairs have poor playability and often play better as an overlimp. When someone overlimps, it often creates a chain reaction of multi-way limp pot. At soft and passive tables, we can overlimp some speculative hands that we might not usually play from earlier positions. We need to be careful not to limp too much at aggressive tables, especially weak suited hands from earlier positions. We can over limp wider from later positions than in earlier positions. This wraps up the segment of limpers. Next, we will look at how to play versus somebody else's open. Earlier, we talked about continuing frequency versus opens. Now, let's take a look at how to divide our continuing range into 3-betting range and flatting range. Most live players don't 3-bet nearly enough and have very unbalanced 3-betting ranges. A typical live 3-betting range might include queens plus and ace king. Now, some guys might include jacks and ace queen, but that's about it. And they're gonna flat with pretty much rest of their playing range. Now, this kind of strategy is pretty common among live players, even some of the winning players. And in my humble opinion, this is a pretty bad approach. Both our 3-betting and flatting range becomes face up, and we become pretty easy to play against. It's very hard to extract value with our big hands when our 3-betting range is this narrow and strong. I think we need to have a robust and balanced 3-betting range in order to play most profitably. 3-betting is very good because it gives us the chance to win the pot immediately, which is huge. And it also thins out the field, buys us position post-flop, and gives us the pre-flop initiative where we can bluff later and win the pot. It also allows us to build big pots with big hands and isolate weak players. Often, 3-betting is a very underrated and underutilized skill in live poker. When considering 3-betting, there are a couple different approaches. One is polarized strategy, and the other is linear strategy. Polarized 3-betting means that we're 3-betting our best hands and worst hands in our playing range. Quick example. If we're facing an MP2 open, we're going to continue with this with MP1 range. So this is our continuing range versus MP2 open. So we're going to 3-bet the top of our range, queens plus and ace king. And we're also going to 3-bet the bottom of our playing range. Hands like ace 3 suited, ace 4 suited, 6-5 suited, 7-6 suited, and maybe ace jack offsuit, king queen offsuit. We're going to be calling with all our middling hands like ace queen, king queen suited, king jack suited, etc. Now, the other strategy is the linear 3-betting strategy. And in the same scenario, now we're going to be 3-betting our entire continuing range as a 3-bet at some frequency. And this gives us more balance to our 3-betting range, and our range becomes more playable, and it just gives us better playability when we get called. So when do we use polarized strategy versus linear 3-betting strategy? Polarized strategy is good when we think that the opener will fold a lot to our 3-bets. For example, a tag opens from hijack. He knows that he's supposed to open a lot from late position, so he does, but when we 3-bet him, he's going to be folding a ton. So this is a great spot. Also, games with short effective stacks, like 100 big blinds, often a response to 3-bet will be either a fold or a 4-bet. There's not a lot of stack depths to call 3-bets and play post-flop. And when we get 4-bet, we have an easy decision with a polarized range. We simply call off with the top of our range and snap fold the bottom part of our range. We really don't 3-bet the middling hands like king queen suited because we don't want to fold to a 4-bet and forfeit our equity with a really good hand with good playability. In later positions like cutoff or button, I generally like a polarized 3-betting strategy because we have position secure post-flop and we get to realize our equity better. Now let's take a look at linear 3-betting. With linear strategy, it's good when we expect our 3-bets to get called often. Especially in deeper games, the typical response to 3-bet is a call. Because of stack depth, players want to see flops with a wide range of hands. So it's nice to have hand that plays well post-flop. Also, if we get 4-bet, we can often continue with hands like Jack 10 suited when we're deep, so we don't have to forfeit our equity like we did in the earlier example of 100 big blinds. In early and mid positions, we don't want to get a bunch of callers behind, So it's nice to use a linear 3-betting strategy to secure position post-flop. So if you look at some real life examples, let's say we're 200 big blinds deep and we face an MP1 open and we're in MP2. As discussed earlier, we want to continue with a range of one spot ahead of the opening range. In this spot, that's under the gun 1. So versus MP1 opening range, this is going to be our continuing range. And because we are in MP2, we have a bunch of players behind us. We really don't want to call and invite people to call behind us. So I want to use a linear 3-betting strategy here and continue as a 3-bet with our entire range. So here I'm going to be 3-betting all these hands. Now, if the villain opens cutoff and we're on the button, again, we want to continue with one spot ahead of the opening range, which is hijack. Now, because we're on the button, we want to be flatting pretty wide. We have position secure post flop, and we get to realize our equity better. So I want to use a polarized 3-betting strategy here. I want to be 3-betting jacks plus, ace queen plus, and also some of our worst hands like king 9 suited, queen 8 suited, jack 8 suited, 5-4 suited, 6-5 suited, and some of these weaker broadways. Now let's take a look at a spot when we're facing an open and we're in the small blind. We're in the worst possible position post flop. We always have to act first, and that cuts down on our profitability quite a bit. We have the big blind behind us, and we invite him to come in cheaply where he can realize his equity. Or even worse, he can squeeze and really put us in a world of hurt. We need to play very tight and aggressive from the small blind. Some strategies call for only 3-betting or folding from the small blind. And this is probably a very fundamentally sound and solid strategy, especially in tough online 6-max games. In live poker, we can probably get away with flatting some of these hands, like small pocket pairs and some suited connectors, but I still tend to 3-bet most of my continuing range from here. In the small blind, my continuing range looks something like this, and as you can see, it's pretty tight. And most of the times I'm going to be 3-betting all these hands. Once in a while, I might flat, some pairs and some suited connectors. And also some of these other hands if there's a good reason. Maybe the big blind is a big spot and we want to bring them along. Or if the opening range is very tight for some reason. But generally, we don't want to be calling too much from the small blind. And we want to be pretty aggressive with 3-betting. Now from the big blind, it's almost the exact opposite. We're closing the action, and because we have money in the pot, we're getting very favorable pot odds to call. Here I'm defending really wide. I'm usually going to defend about 150% of the opening range of the villain and adjust as necessary. So if the villain opens, let's say 20% from MP, I'm going to be defending about 30% from the big blind. If the villain opens 40 to 45% from the button, I'm going to be defending about 60 to 65% versus that range from the big blind. Pretty wide. So this will include very weak hands like king 8 off or king 5 off that you normally might consider unplayable. But when we're closing the action and getting good pot odds and have enough equity in the hand, we can absolutely continue as long as we can play reasonably well post-flop. If you look, even a trashy hand like king 8 offsuit has 45% equity versus the button opening range. Now, if you were to be conservative and assume lower realized equity, we still need only about 33% equity because we're getting 2-to-1 pre-flop if the villain's opening a reasonable size like 3x or 3.5x. Because we're calling so wide from the big blind, we also want to have enough strong hands in our calling range. We want to have hands like ace-jack suited and king-queen suited because we're going to have some weak trashy hands like king 6 offsuit. So our 3-betting range from the big blind will be pretty polarized for the most part. I will 3-bet my top hands like tens or jacks plus, ace queen plus, and then I'm going to be 3-betting some of my weakest suited hands like 6-3 suited, 5-3 suited, 4-3 suited. I'm generally going to stay away from 3-betting these offsuit hands because they just have no playability whatsoever post flop. Now, if you notice, I don't really have small pocket pairs in my 3-betting range. This is because small pairs play very well as a call. They play badly in 3-bet pots due to poor playability. They have what's called polarized flop equity distribution, and basically it means that most of the times it flops very low equity, and sometimes it flops very high equity when it flops a set. And it plays well multi-way pre-flop because it can make a nut hand or close to it. It doesn't mind multi-way action, so it makes a lot of sense to just call a raise. On the other hand, suited connectors and suited broadways have smooth flop equity distribution. This means that it generally flops pretty well, but not nutted. There's going to be many flops where these hands can continue comfortably, but they can be dominated in multi-way pots because they often make good but not nutted hands. So it plays much better heads up. You can feel better about the pair that you make or your flush draw or straight draw in heads up spots. This doesn't mean that they should be thrown away all the time when it's multi-way, but we need to proceed carefully. As you can see, these hands play much better with the 3-bet initiative pre-flop where we can thin out the field. Now that we discussed 3-betting ranges and frequencies, let's talk about sizing. Generally, when we're in position, we can make it somewhat smaller. Depending on the stack sizes, I like making it about 3x the initial raise size and adding 1x for each caller. So if MP1 opens for $20 at 2.5, I'll make it 60 and I'll add $20 for each caller. So if there are 2 callers, I'll make it 100. From out of position, I like to make it much larger, generally about 5x the opening size, and adding 1x for each caller. This may sound pretty big, but we want to make sure to give our villains a bad price to call if they're going to be in position versus us. Position is king, and we want to charge the max. Versus a $20 open here, I'll make it 100 to go from the blinds and add $20 per caller. To recap, a polarized range consists of 3-betting the very top hands and very bottom hands in our playing range. A linear range consists of 3-betting our entire playing range, including our top hands, bottom hands, and middling hands. In both of these scenarios, I generally don't 3-bet small pairs and they're continued as a call. Again, polarized strategy is good when we expect the villains to fold a lot, when the effective stacks are short, and it's also good from the late positions like cutoff and button, and also in the big blind. 3-betting a linear range is good when we expect to get called a lot, in deeper stack games and versus villains who are stubborn. It's also good when we're in the earlier positions and also in the small blind. Now, we can deviate from this strategy when we have additional information. Let's say the preflop raiser has a ridiculously tight opening range. I may choose to flat a lot of hands. We can also sometimes pick up on sizing tails. Someone who opens for 6x is probably not a good target for light 3-betting. If there's a whale in the big blind, this may influence us to call more than 3-betting so that we can play post-flop versus the whale where he might make some massive mistakes. Also, if you pick up on some weak sizing tail or other live reads, sometimes we can make a big exploit and squeeze with any 2 cards to pick up dead money. David Chan has a 3-bet podcast dedicated to this kind of stuff, so I'm not going to repeat them here, but there are just a lot of variables involved in 3-betting. This wraps it up for this video. On the final video, we will talk about how to respond versus 3-bets and putting it all together. In our final video of the Preflop series, we're going to take a look at how to respond to 3-bets. This is probably one of the toughest spots that we can face pre-flop. Getting 3-bet is bad. If we have a loose cannon to our left that constantly 3-bets, it will really make our life miserable, and we'll have to adjust quite a bit by opening much tighter. When considering defending versus 3-bets, it is too complex and situation dependent to just plot out on a chart. It depends on so many variables that are always changing. What we can do is discuss some factors that affect our decision making when facing 3-bets. First is position. We can continue with more of our range when we are in position versus a 3-better. This might sound familiar, but position is king. It is so important in no limit hold'em. When we're out of position, we need to proceed more carefully. If we are in early position and we get 3-bet, generally we're going to be looking at a pretty strong range, especially if the 3-better is also in early position. Now, if we open from late position like hijack or cutoff, we could be facing 3-bets that are potentially wide. We're supposed to be opening wider from late positions, and villains are supposed to 3-bet more aggressively versus that range. We can continue with a lot more hands in this configuration. Next, let's consider the villain. Who is the 3-better? Is it an older recreational player who never played a hand in the last 2 hours? Or is it a young European with hoodie and headphone? Now, this video is not about live tells or villain stereotypes, but we can't just ignore them in live poker. There is a lot of physical information that is readily available to us. Also, besides the profile of the villain, we also may have information on his 3-betting frequencies or previous showdowns. Has he 3-bet much in the past? Has he shown down reasonable holdings when he 3-bet? Our continuing range depends on a lot of these variables. We may choose to call or 4-bet more versus an active 3-better and give a little more respect versus the tight 3-better. Now, let's consider sizing. How big did he raise? Obviously, the smaller he makes it, the better pot odds we're getting, and the more that we can continue. For example, if someone min 3-bets, we can easily continue with the entire range that we opened. If he makes a big 3-bet, this gives us worse pot odds, and we can't continue with as many hands. In addition to pot odds, 3-bet sizing may also give us more information about the villain's range. Some villains like raising big with big hands, and others like raising big with weak hands. Knowing these kind of tendencies can be very profitable. However, be careful not to over-rely on these tendencies, especially if you're not sure of their reliability. Lastly, you want to consider your image, game flow, and any other live intangibles that may be relevant. So facing a 3-bet, we can 4-bet, call, or fold. Let's talk about 4-betting first. Most of the time, unless we're super deep, we're gonna want our 4-bets to be very polarized because it will be committing our stacks. We don't want to 4-bet our middling hands that's gonna be in a tough spot if we get 5-bet. Generally, we're 4-betting our top hands that want to play for stacks and adding some bluffs. Typically, it might look something like Kings plus, Ace King, and Ace 5 suited, and Ace 4 suited. Depending on the stacks, position, and the villain, we might want to add Queens and Jacks, but that's only if we are confident playing for stacks with those hands in that configuration. What we don't want to do is 4-betting and then folding good hands. When we 4-bet, we need a clear plan versus a 5-bet. We stack off with the top of our range, we fold the bottom of our range, and we never 4-bet middling hands. We don't want to be raising for information and then folding with half of our stack in the middle. Something to remember, if we put in more than a third of our stack in the pot, we're going to be getting at least 2-1 on our money when the villain shoves. This means that we only need 33% equity to call profitably. So let's take an example. We say we have like Ace King offsuit, and let's see how it does against Kings plus and Ace King. And you can see that it has pretty good equity, 37%. If we take hands like Queens versus the same range, again, we're doing really good. Even if we are conservative and give him only, say, 50% of Ace King offsuit, we're still getting more than 33%. So as you can see, it's really bad to put in a third of our stack and then folding to a shove. we're pretty much priced in even versus some of the strongest ranges. So in general, we should have an easy decision when someone 5-bets us because we figured this out ahead of time. In regards to different types of hands that we want to call with, we can discuss pocket pairs, suited connectors, and suited broadways. As discussed earlier, small pocket pairs have polarized equity distribution where it flops really well or really bad. It does have rather poor playability, but I usually like defending these versus 3-bets. Because we're facing stronger ranges when we get 3-bet, we're going to be up against big pairs a lot more often than in single raise pots. And these hands are ideal candidates for pocket pairs to get a lot of value from when it flops a set. Often, we're going to need to flop a set or just fold, but there's enough implied odds to win a huge pot that is usually profitable to defend with pocket pairs. In 3-bet pots specifically, I may set mine with even just 10 times the raise size in effective stacks, and this is because of increased implied odds in 3-bet configuration. Versus very solid and tough opponents, I may choose to fold my smallest pairs like deuces, threes, and fours, but in general, I like defending pairs. Sometimes we can get lucky and even get to a cheap showdown on some very coordinated board where ace-king or ace-queen didn't want to c-bet. Suited connectors and suited broadways have smooth equity distribution, so it plays well on a lot of flops. These hands especially thrive in heads-up pots where domination is much less of a factor than in multi-way pots. There will be many flops where these hands have good pairs, flush draws, straight draws, or some backdoor equity where it can continue and win later in the hand. Now, some villains have such a narrow and strong 3-betting range where these hands may suffer a little bit in equity realization. Versus these guys, we can adjust by slightly tightening our calling range. King 10 suited and Queen 10 suited are the weakest suited broadways, so we might just fold these and perhaps we can fold some of the weakest suited connectors like 5-4 suited versus these guys. In general, these hands play very well in 3-bet pots and we're looking to defend with them most of the time. Suited aces are flexible and they can be played as a 4-bet, call, or a fold. Let's put these together and look at an example. Let's say we open from MP2 and we get 3-bet by the small blind. This is our opening range from MP2, and from here I want to 4-bet with kings plus, ace-king, ace-5 suited, and ace-4 suited. This is my standard 4-betting range that I'm going to use versus a reasonable opponent. Now, if I have reasons to believe that the small blind is getting out of line, I might expand my 4-bet bluffing range to include hands like ace-3 suited, ace-2 suited, and maybe even ace-9 suited. I like these suited aces for 4-bet bluff because they have blockers and they have some playability and they're suited. If the villain is kind of short and I feel comfortable stacking off, I might add queens to my 4-betting range. And if the villain is very, very tight, I might only 4-bet bluff with ace-5 suited. And if he 5-bets us, only continue with kings plus and ace-king suited. As for calling, I'm going to call all my pocket pairs queens through deuces and the good suited connectors 6-5 suited plus, all the suited broadways, and good suited aces like ace-5 suited, ace-4 suited, and ace-3 suited. The only offsuit hand I'm going to have is ace-queen offsuit. Now, if the villain is very poor player or he's getting out of line, I might expand my calling range to include some suited gappers or all suited aces. And if the small blind is very, very tight, I might fold some of the worst suited broadways like king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, and some of the weakest suited connectors like 5-4 suited and 6-5 suited. Now let's review some of the important things that we discussed earlier in the series. The most important thing is that we need a good solid pre-flop fundamentals as a foundation for our poker game. Good strategy involves being tight but also aggressive. This means that we're going to be playing fewer hands but mostly coming in for an open, ISO raise, or a 3-bet. If you look at the general strategy of typical recreational players, they're playing way too many hands and they're basically trying to make good hands. 2 pairs, trips, straights, and flushes. And unless these guys are epic, they're not just going to spew their stack in a really bad spot. Their main leak is that they're calling way too much preflop with weak hands. And if you really think about this, the simplest way to exploit them is to just pound them pre-flop when they're making the biggest mistakes. What needs to happen is that these players need to pay for their looseness pre-flop. This is where aggressive pre-flop strategy comes in. We need to attack their big blind, their limps, and their opens, and have them check fold on the flop when they miss with a5 suited or jack7 suited, or they call once on the flop and check fold a turn. So we're gonna win 5 or 10 big blinds each time, and we just keep chipping away. And every once in a while they're gonna make a hand and they might win a decent pot like 30 or 4 big blinds. But over the long run, we should attack them enough when they miss so that their lucky hand doesn't break us. Often these players aren't really punished for their weak ranges, and they're able to see a lot of relatively cheap flops and turns, so it's kind of working in their favor. If we only play big hands against these players, we're missing out on a lot of free money. Often we don't get much action when we have big hands, and when we get a lot of action, we've been outflopped. So we need to win a lot of small and medium pots versus these players in order to come out ahead. So just looking at things on a macro level, it's pretty clear the general strategy that's going to win us the most money over the long run. It's aggression. Doyle Brunson talked about this 40 years ago, and it still holds true today. If you take away only one thing from this 5-part series, just remember that aggressive poker is winning poker. Formulate a tight, aggressive pre-flop plan and build everything else on top of that foundation. I hope that you guys like the series on pre-flop fundamentals. This will wrap it up. Thanks for watching.